Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, South Africa, the powerhouse of the continent. But is there enough to go around to create millions of jobs, to justify its place amongst the BRICS nations? Also Lebanon, stable right now, but the chaos of Syria is just a short hop over the border and the effects are being felt.
I'm Frank Contreras inside an automobile factory here in central Mexico, where foreign investment continues to pour in despite ongoing drug-related violence.
Hello there, everyone. If you are a regular CTC viewer, and we hope you are, you might have noticed we've been pulling at a particular thread for the past few weeks, and that is South Africa. So we've decided this week to just grab the whole thing and take a proper look at Africa's biggest and probably most influential economy. Timely because they had some good economic news there this week. GDP figures out for the last 3 months of 2011, which showed the economy grew 3.1%, which is higher than what was expected and actually similar to what's expected this year. But in many respects, South Africa is still a young nation, only having shrugged off the apartheid years 2 decades ago. And as you can imagine, there is plenty of work to do. Here are some of the caveats right now. 7% growth is what South Africa actually needs. At least it needs that to come good on President Jacob Zuma's promise to create 5 million jobs by the year 2020. And remember, unemployment is still at an incredible rate of 23.9%. So just how the man in yellow there, Jacob Zuma, expects to find that needed growth, well, it's not really clear because there's not too much room for more government help. In fact, the projected deficit for next year is 4.6% of GDP, and that could grow with any bad economic news. And then there's all those massive infrastructure projects which have been announced. They'll have the same effect. The central bank already has interest rates very low, despite inflation worries. All up, it paints a picture of a country with high expectations, but very little wiggle room when faced with, say, a further downturn in Europe, which accounts for a third of manufactured exports. Right, there's one person particularly well placed to talk us through South Africa's economic position right now, and I'm pleased to say he's joining us from Pretoria, Pravan Gordhan, who is South Africa's Finance Minister. We thank you for your time, Minister. I'd like to start with, I mentioned it already, that now magic figure, or figures if you like, 5 million jobs created by the year 2020. At current growth rates, that's probably not going to be doable. So what is the plan? Because, you know, you're being very ambitious.
No, we in South Africa have to be ambitious. We have to be ambitious because we have a 300-year history which has deprived the majority black population in South Africa of equal economic opportunities. And we will continue to keep the aspiration there whilst taking account of the reality of the global environment, the fact that most economies in the world are decelerating, and at the same time, we also will look at our own internal opportunities and external opportunities. And so you would be aware that the President of South Africa has announced a fairly major multi-trillion rand infrastructure investment program, which will provide a stimulus to our economy and job employment opportunities. Equally, Africa is the second growing fastest region of the continent, and South Africa is the biggest economy on this continent and has substantial trade linkages which we hope to improve upon. Thirdly, we intend to build on our linkages to emerging markets in the Middle East and other parts of the world, Latin America, Asia, and we believe that such an approach will provide mutual benefits both to those regions and to South Africa as well.
Okay, I'm interested in going back to focus on the internal side of things, if you don't mind. You touched on that before. And again, I'm looking for some specifics, ways in which you will create employment and stimulate growth in the country. It could be argued here that there was a huge opportunity to do all of that already when you had the 2010 Football World Cup, and that it didn't really deliver for the people it should have with jobs, basically. So again, what can you do differently now? What will you do differently?
Well, you know, South Africans generally take a half-full approach as opposed to a half-empty approach. And so we take an optimistic view of life. If we didn't, we wouldn't be free of apartheid post-1994. Remember also that the World Cup happened immediately after the 2008 financial crisis and the recession that followed. South Africa lost 1 million jobs, particularly at the lower end of the economy. In the last year, we've recovered about 400,000 jobs, for example. And whilst the recovery is slow, at least there's a net creation of jobs in this country. But we're very frank with ourselves. We recognize that our history has provided us with huge structural difficulties, which are the structural difficulties that we need to address. So whether they're bottlenecks in the infrastructure layout of this country, particularly impacting upon the mining and agriculture industries, which we now want to invest in over the next decade or so, or our skills capability in South Africa, which we are investing in hugely to upgrade as well. These are all examples of frank recognition of our limitations and very clear programs to actually address them. So the World Cup gave us a valuable opportunity, but I repeat, it came in the middle of a recession. We're now in a post-recessionary recovery, but the situation in Europe is impacting on South Africa as it is impacting on the rest of the world. I've just come back from the G20 meeting in Mexico, where the message is fairly clear. Even the fast-growing economies such as India and China are today decelerating as a result of Europe's inability or refusal to deal with its crisis in a much more urgent way than it has been able to do.
Okay, so you've started talking about the G20. Let's put South Africa into the global picture now. One of our pet topics here, if you like, is the BRICS nations, because it is the growth story. It's where the world is looking to, as you point out, all those problems in Europe. South Africa, of course, is the S in BRICS, the most recent member. How does the country justify its position there? Because there's a lot of competition to join this club, the likes of particularly Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia as well.
Yes, the BRICS in a sense represents a, let's call it South-South venture. And I think the leadership of the BRIC without the S at the time recognized that having the largest economy on the African continent as part of BRICS is a very important signal to the globe that this becomes an important South-South globe. And we are very modest about our presence. We are a population of only 50 million people. We nonetheless have a significant impact on the African economy. And as we grow faster, there will be huge synergies between ourselves and the African economy as well. Our presence in BRICS enables us to represent both ourselves and the African voice and bring an African perspective. Now, there already are important areas of cooperation. The BRICS finance ministers, for example, met prior to the G20 meeting in Mexico. We exchanged thoughts on global growth, on how we see the G20 playing a more assertive coordinating role. We've discussed the position of the World Bank president and what we might want to adopt as our own position. We've begun to develop a model for cooperation around development banking in our respective continents and across the globe as well. And over time, as we reach the summit point in India in March, BRICS and South Africa's humble role within it will begin to gel in a way in which it could become a significant factor.
Do you want more than a humble role, though? I fear South Africa could always be seen as, last on board, the most recent, the most junior addition. But BRICS, it is a group. Do you want a more assertive role for yourself and for South Africa within that group?
Well, I mean, as the opportunity arises, we'll certainly assert our own interests as other countries assert their interests. The emphasis, of course, in the BRICS environment is to create an environment of trust, to create an environment where we recognize common interests, and to create an environment where increasingly we broaden the platform of cooperation. And BRICS is still a youngster in historical terms, and as we learn to work with each other, I'm sure those elements will develop and South Africa will make its contribution.
That is Pravin Gordhan, South Africa's Finance Minister, joining us this week on Counting the Cost from Pretoria. Mr. Gordhan, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, just what are all these ships doing sitting at anchor off the coast of Malaysia? How the global slowdowns hit the cargo industry and the fishermen now in the shadow of the ships. Right now, though, Lebanon. In particular, Lebanon's relationship with Syria and what the uprising there is doing to the local economy. Of course, Lebanon's economy is no stranger to disruption, having been through civil war and years of instability itself. But with Syria in pretty much a shambles just over the border, trade has slowed down with an important market. More from James Bays now in Lebanon.
Lorries queuing on the main road from Lebanon to the Syrian capital Damascus. The international border is still open, but the amount of traffic and trade has been reduced as a result of 11 months of violence and turmoil in Syria. This is the Lebanese town of Shtora, about 30 kilometers from the frontier, a place where the economy is built on cross-border trade. In the exchange offices, where you can change Syrian currency into Lebanese, the dealers say business is down by 80%. Taxi drivers tell me they rarely find any customers who want to go to Syria. Before, every week, how many times you go to Damascus? Every day?
Every day. Every day.
Now?
Now, every week,
one trip.
One way.
When the Syrian people were here, we used to work with them. We took them to Syria, brought them back, and we got paid for it. But it's not the same anymore.
This is one of Syria's economic lifelines, the main road between Beirut and Damascus. At the moment, there's snow on the high ground, but normally it takes just 2 hours to travel between the two capitals. That proximity has meant in the past that political upheaval in one country has had a major economic effect in the other. Last year, 2011, brought an end to 4 years of impressive economic growth in Lebanon. There has been a downturn, but the impact hasn't been that great yet. Lebanese businesses are resilient, used to functioning in a turbulent region.
It is worrying.
But one economist fears there is a nightmare scenario if the trouble in Syria drags on.
It's been manageable and it's been limited impact that we're having now. You can imagine the worst case scenario when things goes out of control. Then you would imagine waves of Syrians coming, because there are already a huge number of Syrians working here. I would imagine that there will be a huge number of Syrians again coming here.
Tourism bookings are said to be down about 25%. Despite that, some hotels are still doing well. Rich Syrians have fled here, and businessmen who would have gone to Damascus are now having their meetings in Lebanon instead.
We're going to break this down a bit more now with someone who has the right kind of inside knowledge about this economic relationship between Syria and Lebanon. Jihad Azur joining us this week from Bahrain, actually, though he is the former finance minister of Lebanon. Jihad, thank you for your time. Tell me your gut feeling here when you look at what is happening in Syria right now. What is your biggest fear for Lebanon, given that this has now been going on for pretty much a year?
Well, implications of what's happening in Syria on the Lebanese economy are fairly contained as far as what we saw in the last year or so. As you know, the Lebanese economy is very well connected to the region, but in terms of impact from what's happening in Syria was substantially limited on the trade side. On the tourism, it had some impact last year. On the financial side, we had, especially with the Lebanese banks operating in Syria, some implications, but banks were able to contain it. The only risk that, or the only issue that remains, is the political risk that could affect FDIs and capital flows to Lebanon.
And just perhaps could I also suggest the general sentiment? You know, you talked about tourism there. People would be very reluctant, I would think, to come to maybe Lebanon, the wider region as well, when there is still so much unrest around.
Well, in fact, we didn't see it when it comes to the number of tourists coming to Lebanon. In fact, the issue was for those who usually use the road to come to Lebanon, especially those coming from Jordan, from Saudi and other places. And I think what is important today is to find other means of transport for those who usually use the road to come to Lebanon. As I said, despite the fact that the Lebanese economy is connected to the region, in terms of its direct connection to, in terms of goods and services with Syria, it's fairly limited. And as you know, the Lebanese economy is an economy that adapts very quickly. And I'm sure that already both banks, traders and industrialists have already made arrangements in order to overcome the events that are taking place in Syria today.
And as an extension of that, I wonder maybe has Lebanon's economy, or maybe Lebanon's history is more the point I'm making, actually plays a role here. The fact that it has had to absorb shocks for many years with civil war and political uncertainty within Lebanon, perhaps it's been able to learn, lessons from that past.
Well, indeed, as you know, the Lebanese economy went through several shocks in the last decades. And even very recently in 2006 and onward, we had also a certain number of shocks. What differentiates the Lebanese economy from others is the ability to adjust very quickly and to absorb shocks, and also the ability to be resilient whenever there are pressures. What also makes the Lebanese economy recently more different, that in the last 5 years or so, we had fairly high level of growth when other regional economies were not enjoying the same level of growth. And also, we experienced a big surge in capital flows that helped the Lebanese banks to be very liquid, and the Lebanese economy to be able to sustain in the next year or two a low level of growth. Mind you that in 2011, the level of growth went down from 7% in 2010 to 1.5%, and we don't expect 2012 to be a year where growth will be very, very buoyant.
So to that end, what else has affected you there? We've discussed regional issues. Does it go beyond that, though? Does it head out into the wider problems, the European problems as well?
Yes, indeed. What's happening in Europe also have an impact on Lebanon. As you know, Europe is our main trade partner. More of almost 45 to 50% of our imports in terms of goods come from Europe. And some of our exports go to Europe, especially Switzerland, Austria, and other countries. Definitely what we are seeing in Europe today is going to have an impact. Maybe it's going to benefit some our trade partners that are outside the Eurozone, like China, India, Turkey. But definitely the Lebanese economy today is affected by the regional political development, the international slowdown, and mainly what's happening in Europe. And this is why we don't expect 2012 to be a year where growth will be high, or to be a year where we will experience a surge in foreign direct investment.
And as Jihad Azur, the former finance minister of Lebanon, thank you so much for your time this week. Now, we showed you some of these pictures a little bit earlier. There are hundreds of ships at anchor off Malaysia's coast. It's quite a sight, really. And there's actually two stories here. One is the effect it's having on the local communities. Guys like these, the lobster fishermen, it's a big industry there. But they say debris and pollution from the ships is really affecting their hauls, which then leads us to the second story, of course. Why are the ships there? Well, basically, there's too many ships chasing too little cargo, and it's actually cheaper to have them sitting out here than to dock them in port or have them sailing at near empty levels. Earlier in the week, I spoke to Tony Nash from IHS Global Services in Singapore about that problem and if there's any way around that downturn right now. Have a look.
A lot of these shipping lines in 2009, in the depths of the recession, commissioned new vessels to be made. So they've got newer, higher capacity vessels out there, and these vessels, because of the global financial crisis and the collapse of global trade, but now because of the replacement with these new ships, they just don't really have much to do with these ships.
It's basic supply and demand in the end, though, isn't it? I mean, when times are good, sure, we need more ships, we've got to be shipping more cargo around, and now it's just
Sure.
a bad time.
Sure, it is. We've got a growth in vessels, in container vessels, of about 8.5% this year on the supply side, but the demand side for container shipping will be between 1 and 1.5%. So, the supply far outstrips demand, and so, these smaller ships, until the demand for global trade comes back, it's going to be very difficult. And you just don't see that demand coming back very rapidly when you look at U.S. GDP growth, when you look at what's happening in the Eurozone, and you even look at the slowdown in places like China. The demand for finished goods and the replacement rate of goods just isn't necessarily coming back until some of these developed economies can repair their balance sheets.
And just briefly, Tony, what about this actual issue we've got, as we highlighted in our report, the ships that are sitting out there, and the fishermen say this is having a negative effect on us? I mean, can anyone move in and do anything about that, or is this all fine?
It's unlikely unless it's a multilateral action. They're outside of the Port Authority of Singapore. They're likely outside of the Port Authority of Malaysia. So there really is not unilateral Port Authority action that can be taken. So it's really a multilateral activity that needs to be undertaken, and we just don't necessarily think that that's going to happen at this point. Maybe if it becomes more of an issue, but right now you've got maybe just less than 5% of the container fleet sitting out there. That's a lot. But it's just not enough for people. It's not a danger yet, and until it is, very little action will likely be taken.
We're turning to Mexico now, parts of it violent and lawless, overrun by gangs. But in a business sense, Mexico is becoming increasingly competitive as an export hub. For one thing, Mexican labour costs are down. 5 years ago, they were 260% more than Chinese labour. Now the gap is just 14% due to wage inflation and high costs in China. Forgetting, of course, Mexico benefits from having the world's largest economy right on its northern doorstep. Have a look at this now from Frank Contreras, who travelled to one of the country's biggest investors in central Mexico.
Foreign investment in central Mexico is on the rise. While Europe and the United States are dealing with the economic crisis, investors say Mexico is still a good place for doing business. Not even rising drug violence here puts investors off. Japanese automaker Nissan is leading the charge. Their CEO says despite Mexico's image as a dangerous place, Nissan will invest another $2 billion here, expanding operations in 2013.
We feel pretty secure in Mexico and pretty confident to continue to develop this business, not only inside Mexico, but the export business in a way which is very satisfactory. So there is absolutely no concern.
Coca-Cola recently announced it will invest $1 billion and create 10,000 new jobs in Mexico. The aerospace industry also says this is a safe place to invest, making Mexico a new global leader in that sector. A financial expert says drug violence is clearly not stopping foreign investment here.
The level of violence such that hurts commerce and infringes on economic activities happens only in the north and in specific zones. It's not generalized.
The giant Nissan production factory in Aguascalientes has been operating for 30 years. It's become one of the Japanese automaker's most productive and efficient global production sites. Most of its vehicles and parts made here go to the vast U.S. market. Nissan says the well-trained labor force is another reason to invest here. Fabricio Moran was once an undocumented worker in the United States, but he came to work for the company in 1998.
My life has changed dramatically. Because of my job here, I've been able to buy my own house, a car, and most importantly, pay for a good school for my children.
On the average, Mexican factory workers earn less than $5 a day. Labor costs here are slightly higher than in China, but still competitive given the advantage of Mexico's geographical location. And labor strikes in Mexico are uncommon.
This automobile factory operates virtually non-stop, 24 hours a day. The workers here are on 12-hour shifts, and every hour they're producing 65 automobiles, most of them for export.
The majority of these vehicles still go to the U.S., but demand is expected to drop this year because of slower growth there. The Mexican government has been criticized for giving companies huge tax breaks and keeping wages low. Underemployment reaches 25% across the country. These high-tech workers at a separate company told Al Jazeera they earn $220 a month. But the federal government says innovations and increased efficiency are the real reasons foreign companies are investing now in Mexico.
Before we were just assemblers, then we started to produce our own parts. Now the percentage of vehicles with quality Mexican parts is rising. Those innovations give us the added value of more efficient production.
Economic activity means that many workers are getting more opportunities for better training in areas such as construction.
The companies are looking for people who have more training, experience and schooling.
The presence of eager foreign investors is starting to have the side effect of improving education in this country, which has been criticized for having one of Latin America's lowest education levels.
When companies come, that generates more incentives among the Mexican population to become better educated and better trained in order to receive better paying jobs and grow with these multinational companies.
All of this is helping keep the Mexican economy relatively vibrant compared to other parts of the world, which is good news for a country struggling with security problems.
And that is where we're going to leave you for this week. But if you want to get in touch, here's how to do it. Twitter, easiest way. @Kamal AJE is me. @Abid Oliver Ali is our business editor, and email is there as well, countingthecost@aljazeera.net. And while you're online, you can go to aljazeera.com/business. Click onto the CTC page from the link at the top. We put all our episodes up there in full for you to catch up on whenever is convenient for you. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santa Maria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.